Right, well, welcome everybody, and thanks for coming along this lunchtime to this Institute for Policy Research event. I'm Nick Pearce, I'm the director of the Institute, and I'm really glad to be hosting today Professor Glen O'Hara. Glen is one of our leading modern and contemporary historians in the UK. He's written a lot about contemporary Britain, a very good book back in 2009, I think it was, Glen, called Britain and the Sea. If you're interested in the relationship between the United Kingdom and our seas, that's a great book to read. Written about the water industry, written about Harold Wilson's governments, but today he's here to talk about his new book on the Blair governments. And I think I was just clarifying with Glen before we started that it is the Blair governments, not the totality of the new Labour government, so it goes 1997 to 2007. Glen is basically, well, those governments are now the subject of history. Contemporary historians are now writing about them, which for people like me who used to work for those governments is a slightly odd feeling. But it is very important, this actually, because the sort of legacy of those governments is something that is politically contested. It's still important in how we think about contemporary politics, how we assess the legacy of those governments. It's clearly something that divides people broadly on the left in their assessment of those governments, and of course it has continuing effects, as we've seen with the Starmer government recruited, catastrophized, or catastrophically I should say, recruited one of the leading figures in that period to become ambassador to the US. So the aftershocks of this period are still important, but how we interpret them is also important too. So we're really grateful to have Glen with us today. We're recording this. I'll do some Q&A with Glen afterwards, an opportunity for opening up questions, but just to let you know that we will be filming this. But Glen, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nick, for that very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming, and thank you for the invite to the University of Bath, which I've just seen the campus of, I think for the first time ever, which looks really rather lovely in the sunshine. So that buoyed my spirits somewhat in the kind of continuing disaster of the Labour Party's history. But on that topic, I'm here today to talk about the Blair years, as Nick's already introduced me, which is becoming a matter of historical study, traditionally rather like any kind of era, like the Wilson government emerged into history from the archive in the 1990s, and the Thatcher era has been much written about for the last 10 or 15 years. That partly was about the availability of government papers after 30 years, and now, for the most part, 20 years after Gordon Brown's reform to freedom of information laws. But it's certainly a topic and a subject that's now becoming, perhaps with the passage of time, rather more considered, analytical, argumentative, rather than rhetorical, or about the day-to-day, here today, gone tomorrow controversies of the time, such as the Dome, or for instance the Hinduja passport affair. Who can remember the ins and outs of the Hinduja passport affair, about which Peter Mandelson was in the end exonerated? I know you're recording this, so what I can say is constrained, I'm afraid, but we can turn that off at some point towards the end, perhaps. And my theme will be, did New Labour change British economy and society? To which my answer in the book, and there's some flyers there on your way out, rather than me lugging all the hundreds of books up the hill from the train station, the answer is very much yes. But I don't think that's so controversial. I think what's controversial on the left and the right is how, why, and the wherefores of how it changed the British economy and British society. Now, as we've already heard referenced, this is something that a lot of us here, not you students, some of you, but a lot of us here can remember personally. Now, I was a young graduate student at this moment, and I vividly remember the extremely sunny and warm, very much like outside today actually, the sunny and warm morning of the 2nd of May 1997. And this was a day when a new, young, youthful, charismatic Labour leader strode into number 10 on a huge landslide, and what you might call a lovely landslide in contrast to the loveless landslide of 2024, which is to some extent won by default, given how hated the Conservative government of Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss and Boris Johnson had become. This was very much the country, even deep England, and I'll come to that in a minute, even deep England throwing in its lot with New Labour, which Tony Blair had successfully rebranded, partly with the help of Peter Mandelson, but also with a huge number of other influential figures, think tanks, papers, ideas, and genuine intellectual thought, which I'll come to again in a moment. This was a moment so fresh in the mind that I even witnessed people in the street embracing each other who were strangers. That British verboten formula that you mustn't do in the UK. And I even saw people who didn't know each other speak to each other on the tube, which is normally subject to criminal prosecution in normal times. But there was a genuine sense of the new. There was a genuine sense, I think, of opportunity after a long, long period of Conservative government, in a way that Keir Starmer's victory in 2024, although huge, did not evoke in the same manner. Getting 44 to 45% of the vote is very, very different and much harder than getting 34% of the vote. And of course, Keir Starmer's victory would have been nowhere near as big had Reform UK not been on the electoral playing field, although he still would have won a majority, almost certainly. And what I want to stress is just how difficult it is to win a majority when you're the Labour Party. This, in 1997, is the first time it's ever happened in British history that the Labour Party, in peacetime, comes out of opposition against a government that had won a majority in the previous election and wins a durable majority that would last for a whole parliament itself on its own. 1945, Britain was still at war in the Asia-Pacific. 1964, it wins a tiny majority of 3. 1974, it doesn't win a majority at all. And this, therefore, is a huge and historic victory, not quite matched by the number of seats Starmer wins, and certainly not matched by the vote share. My colleague Richard Toy, who teaches at the University of Exeter, likes to joke that the Labour Party's point, the Labour Party's intention, is to lose general elections and to serve as a ginger group or think tank in opposition and to hold the Conservatives to account. Unfortunately, Labour sometimes, in a fit of absence of mind, manages to win a general election and then actually has to govern, which is much, much harder than just saying what you would do or opposing a kind of bumbling Conservative government like the governments of John Major, who of course now looks pretty good compared to some of his successors, or Rishi Sunak, both of whom in many ways are relatively centrist leaders compared to the right wing that's begun to emerge in the UK. One of the stories, as I said earlier, is that Labour, which had only won a handful of seats in southern England, begins to win seats that it never really thought it would. For instance, Hove, down here, which Tony Blair cannot believe on the flight down that he's won when Alastair Campbell tells him on his pager. Nice 1990s detail there, a pager. That was a telecommunications device for those of you who are too young to remember. But it wins seats, it wins seats Reading, Swindon, for instance, suburban Bristol, and in the slew of seats in Hertfordshire, like Luton, for instance, up there to the north of London, which it couldn't have dreamed of winning in 1987 and 1992, which of course is partly to the credit Neil Kinnock and John Smith and all the huge amount of work they had done laying the groundwork for this victory. And indeed Blair, as is his wont rhetorically, he pays tribute to them in his speeches of May 1997. Another story which is often forgotten, of course, is the Liberal Democrats' electoral triumph and the Liberal Democrats' quite quiet landslide, especially in the southwest of England, where they sweep the Conservatives aside under Paddy Ashdown, who's also a charismatic, brilliant rhetorician and popular leader who's in the pluses, which is almost unheard of today, where our most popular leaders, Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage, are like, -6 to -15. The idea that you would be like Blair in the autumn of 1997, +60 to +80, or like Paddy Ashdown, +20 to +30, would be almost impossible now in a more divided electorate. So what I want to emphasise is just how difficult this is, and just how impossible this is, and just how impressive this is. And not just to do that once, but to do it twice, including in 2001, which is not to say, of course, that there were not problems and there were not failures, and that like all political careers, and indeed like all lives perhaps, a lot of the impetus, glamour, intellectual and popular coalition that Blair had assembled begins to disintegrate under the laws of entropy, the costs of governing, where you gradually annoy people and in the end you've annoyed lots of people, but also then to some extent falls off a cliff over the issue that casts like a pall over the Blair years, which is the Iraq War, which of course again resonances today, where Keir Starmer does he goes the other way, which is he refuses to take part in offensive action, not defensive action, but offensive action against Iran, partly for this exact reason. Now, although the book isn't about foreign policy, it's about domestic policy, and I hope there'll be volumes and volumes about foreign policy. For instance, there'll be a volume about Northern Ireland, no doubt the triangular diplomacy of over Northern Ireland, or perhaps square-shaped diplomacy, and there'll certainly be books and books and books about Blair's relationship with George W. Bush. On the domestic front, what this does is that it's never glad, confident morning again. Although we have to remember that Tony Blair wins an election after this, and he wins it quite handily, with not very much difficulty, with the majority of 66, the intellectual coalition and the popular coalition is broken apart by another Liberal Democrat surge under Charles Kennedy as an anti-war party, and a return of the Conservative Party to some of their more natural seats, for instance, in inner to outer London, because Blair is seen as having lied about the dossier, seen by many people to have lied about the double dossier of evidence over the Iraq War, and is seen as having betrayed the British national interest, even by voters who are not so interested in whether governments, lie or don't lie, but betrayed the British national interest where there wasn't a national interest in terms of joining the offensive American war in Iraq. And remember, the Americans actually give Blair at least 2 opportunities to step off that conveyor, where Rumsfeld, Cheney and Bush himself say that we know everyone has a public opinion, everyone has opinion polls, everyone has an opposition. If you can't do it, you can offer us security and intelligence and political support. We don't need the ground troops, because frankly they're quite small anyway. Blair's view is that you have to be next to the Americans come what may, partly because you can then influence them. But that's, to some extent, another story. But domestically, what it does is it sucks away his popularity, only to come back in a relatively strong kind of autumnal glow in the summer of 2005 over terrorist attacks on London. He's seen as dealing with quite effectively, and over winning the Olympics, winning the 2012 Olympics. So Blair's glamour and attractions that, to many of you is probably a puzzle, certainly was there, because even after the disaster of the Iraq War and Iraq's collapse into catastrophic sectarian civil war, Blair wins elections and is, not very unpopular. So he has something. It will not also have escaped your notice that Blair becomes even more unpopular after office, because some of his business activities and the activities of his private sector interests are seen as very unpopular. They're seen as helping dictatorships, for instance, in Central Asian gas republics. Of course, Blair would say that he's advising these countries on economic and social liberalisation and political liberalisation. But voters take it that basically this is someone who's in it for the money after power, and therefore advising whoever will bid the most. And of course, he continues to make interventions which are sometimes popular, sometimes unpopular. It's interesting that you can choose your interventions, like John Major this week, on popular or unpopular topics, and he continues with the masochism strategy of saying incredibly unpopular things, even though he doesn't have to. Partly because he just likes the fight. He'll cross the road for an intellectual fight. And also remember, we've now built this phenomenon of very young ex-prime ministers like Rishi Sunak, who, despite one's political differences with, are very, very able, and now have 30 years of careers for, David Cameron just to play tennis with a machine for 20 years, which seems like a huge waste. And of course, Blair is seeking a role. What happens then, and what happens then thereafter, though, in the 2010s and 2020s, and here I will parallel Blair, as in lots of ways actually, with Harold Wilson, is that his stock begins strangely to rise again. The numbers begin to float upwards. Now, partly that's the enchantment of distance, and thinking about also a period when he was leader, when the country had 3% productivity growth every year, and you could afford lots of nice things. Also, he was a great speaker, and he always knew what he thought. Indeed, you knew what he was going to say almost before he opened his mouth, which voters quite like. But his numbers go from catastrophic, minus 49, minus 50. They start to go up to minus 40, minus 30, minus 20. What's this? Minus 25. So about as unpopular as Kemi Badenoch, which I accept as a low bar, but equally is a much higher bar than he was before. One of the reasons for that is not just the enchantment of distance and the nostalgia for a time when economic growth was rapid, those are there, but it was partly that he became like the godfather of the cult in the country that we could call Romania, as opposed to Livia or the Republic of Leave. And because everything Blair said and warned about in the Remain campaign and the EU referendum campaign comes true step by step by step by step. And of course, this is again not a partisan point, because that's exactly what we could say about John Major and his numbers too. So lots of voters who live in Liberal Democrat Bath or live in, Green East Bristol, who don't like Blair, begin to say, well, you didn't like him, but on the other hand, he was right about that Brexit, the key issue of the day. So it wasn't all so bad. There is, of course, also the process by which people like me come along and, for career-orientated reasons, come and revise the record and become these kind of quote-unquote revisionists about these people. So it was about 25 years after Wilson left Number 10 that Ross McKibben wrote his famous essay, Homage to Wilson and Callaghan, in the London Review of Books, which began to rehabilitate the record of these social democratic leaders, which had fallen so far that Wilson was almost a ghost, also suffering with dementia or Alzheimer's as well in the 1980s. But he was almost a ghost before that even. It's about 25 years, and now it's about 25 years since Blair left office. It's about the same amount of time. It's just about 20 years now. So it's also a natural process. I have no doubt that in the fullness of time, perhaps rightly, people will say Theresa May sought a Brexit compromise that would have been better than what we got. Not an unfair comment. Or that Boris Johnson got us first to the vaccine. Again, not an unfair comment. Or that David Cameron passed gay marriage. So you can always hold on to something in premierships, even those seen as disastrous failures like those 3 premierships. And you can say, well, there were successes, and to some extent this is what we're doing. This was by any measure, therefore, just to talk about those successes, this was an enormously popular government and leader for a long, long, long time. This is one of the charts from the book, which just parallels long periods of office, Tories in the 50s, Tories in the 80s, and the Blair period in black. And it's just lead over the other party. And it's way, way above, throughout the first Parliament, the other numbers, and only falls to normal levels, these are just months, after about 120 months, about the time of the Iraq War. And there's lots of these charts, but you can, on every measure, Blair leads the pack against previous Labour governments, against previous long-serving governments, in terms of popularity, in terms of months of leads. This is an unprecedented, and it's not happened again with either the previous Conservative government or this Labour government, whose numbers will just fall off a cliff right straight away in comparison if I updated this chart from the book. So he's doing something right. So as a historian, what we want to do is get behind the process of change and not look back on it, but look forward from where we were in 1997 and say, well, what was going right therefore, as opposed sometimes to the kind of unattractive judgmentalism of it's easy for me to sit in my study and say, oh, the Prime Minister got this and this wrong, when the Prime Minister has, like I was just saying the other day, intelligence flowing in every day. Blair was spending about a quarter to his third of his time on Northern Ireland through quite a lot of this early years of this premiership. It's all very well for us to say as academics, you should have done this, but this has become an almost impossible task. Well, the first thing Blair had was he had a strategy. One might say, perhaps unlike the present administration at Westminster. Because Blair's analysis was very big, very bold, like the Thatcherite analysis, which is, we've just got to get more competitive by shaking out labour markets, that's it. Nice, multicoloured, technicoloured analysis, which had some truth to it and some untruth to it. Well, Blair's analysis is globalisation is onrushing, oncoming, inevitable, and it's going to change everything. Looks a little bit anachronistic to us, that analysis, but on the other hand, remember in the late 90s, early 2000s, that was intellectually all the rage to talk about how globalisation was going to reshape the world. And of course it did reshape the world. It reshapes production chains, where production happens, production moves to China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, for instance. That's just one way it transformed the world. So Blair's mission becomes, so you've got your analysis, partly in debt to people like Tony Giddens, or lots of other thinkers who we'll finish with. Blair's analysis becomes, how do you equip the British people to stand up to that tsunami of globalisation? And the first answer is education. So famously you say education, education, education. So we get the school delivery unit in the first term under Michael Barber, who later becomes head of the general delivery unit. And it's basically no child will leave school without 3 C's at core GCSE subjects. That's it. No tolerance for failure. That's it. Which is an incredibly ambitious target. we will abolish relative child poverty within 2 terms. An unbelievably ambitious goal, which became harder and harder to get at because you're getting into deeper and deeper poverty. But you couldn't imagine a government thinking that and saying that today in much more difficult times. And of course, deleterious to my mental health to say it, but higher education will be well funded, will expand, and will be well organised, which of course is quite the opposite to a higher education system in England, Wales and Scotland today. That said, I've kind of praised that by inference, that kind of approach, because of course I agree with lots and lots of more money spent on education, and especially higher education. But there are also views which Blair continues to espouse today, which you'll be familiar with, which I call in the book I kind of call the techno fix. Tony Blair has always been enamoured of technological solutions. Again, rather like Wilson, he's someone who thinks that the future is probably going to be reshaped, actually in a Marxian manner, which is the means of production and exchange are the means which shape the intellect and shape society. It's a very interesting Marxist influence on Blair, which we could talk about. And the government has to react to the internet age, the online age, the global age. So you should be able to choose your NHS consultant with your GP by looking at success rates sitting there in the GP consultancy room. I'm not sure you do that in a 10-minute consultation after they've thought about what's wrong with you, but anyway, that's the ambition. Going to be, which Blair talks about all the time at the moment, biometric ID cards with all your government data on them, like your national insurance record, etc., your immigration record, your passport number, etc. There'll be tenant choice, where you could look, which is trialled in lots of councils, especially in London, where you can look at different council flats and houses to look at what you want rather than just be given by the council, because this all has the intellectual heft of moving citizens from rights-based citizens to consumer-based citizens, which is bound up in this techno fix. It, however, will not have escaped your notice that a lot of these bullet points here are total disasters. The Post Office Horizon, which of course the government inherits from the previous government, but does push with Fujitsu, which is partly one of the other disasters, is one of the worst catastrophes of all time in government IT procurement and management. NHS spine and choose and book collapse. The e-university becomes an incredibly expensive fraud case where people buy the e-university credits for a kind of complicated fraud bargain system. So this is not without its risks, the technological solution. Though Blair today, as he gets older, like all of us, he becomes more like himself. So he just talks about technology more and more. And he's recently written a pamphlet a couple of years ago with William Hague about why ID cards are a good idea. So whatever you say to Blair, he'll often say, ID cards will solve that, which is maybe true, but it might not be true for all of those problems. And you saw the Starmer government with a short-lived flirtation with those ideas late last year. However, many of the ideas that come from the Treasury and from the name I haven't yet uttered, Gordon Brown, they are perhaps more successful. Because although this is the nice era, this is the nice Goldilocks era where the economy is not too hot, not too cold, inflation is rather low, the world economy is expanding, the American economy is booming and pulling everybody else towards it. China is opening up to the World Trade Organization, that's helping to dampen inflation. So the world environment is kindly to economic success. However, Britain does rather better, it's the black line again, than the other developed powers, than many of the other developed powers. Here it is overtaking Italy for productivity, which in the 1950s and 1960s would not have been seen as much of a success, but it was certainly a success by the time we get to the 1990s, and approaching, at least in the early 2000s, approaching the levels of the leaders in productivity. So Britain is clearly doing something right in this strange dual monarchy of a government where Blair is often in charge of foreign policy and strategy and Brown is in charge of lots of the nuts and bolts of delivery via the Treasury's control over spending ministries. What is this? This is possibly what we might call in the jargon pre-commitment. It's the idea that it's very, very clear to business, the third sector, and everybody in government where the government's going, where it's going to be in 5 years, and what it's going to do over the 5 to 10 year planning horizon. Something which Wilson had not been able to achieve with the National Plan in 1965 or the Productivity Councils in 1967 and 1968. via comprehensive spending reviews, 5, 7, 8 years ahead, via the independence of the Bank of England, via public sector agreements with departments, the government says this is what the economy will look like in 5 years. And I think that does play a role in lifting productivity growth and therefore economic growth. And one of the reasons I think that, which is complicated and kind of jargonistic, is that the higher productivity rate, we'd kill for this now, and we could have lots of nicer things, and we could have a lot more operations and nurses and teachers and teaching assistants or whatever. Much lower since, in the age of kind of Brexity chaos and coalition austerity. And also that improvement in productivity comes from inside companies. It doesn't come from new entrants. It doesn't come from challenger companies. It comes from inside mid-sized to larger-sized companies. And therefore that helps to suggest that Brown's idea, Keynesian idea, of forward planning and growth targeting and employment targeting, not just inflation targeting, remember, that plays a role in accelerating British productivity growth and accelerating, or at least supporting, growth. Yes, they'd inherited a fairly good economy from Clark and Major. Clark, one of the most successful chancellors of the post-war era. Yes, they were in a benign environment, but you still have to not mess it up. And actually, equally, Britain does better than some of the others. So there's something going on here which I think actually probably will reward further discussion. Because Brown doesn't just target inflation, a mission he gives to the Bank of England through its independence, partly urged by Ed Balls in 1997. Brown also targets, and he mentions in the White Paper, which deliberately echoes the Keynesian 1944 White Paper, that the government will target a low and stable level of unemployment. When I was a boy, unemployment up to 12%, 4 million people unemployed in the bad old days, and that comes right back down to something like the post-war era's unemployment, albeit for just a few years, for 5 years. But this would have been an unimaginable policy success in the 1980s. And no one even talks about it. Rather today, like, people don't talk about the fall in sudden death of infants, or they don't talk about the fall in drowning, or the fall in violent crime, or the better air quality. When you solve a problem, people just move on to the next problem, which is a problem of governance that's become, as higher expectations become very difficult to manage. So far, I've talked a lot about the labourist, and you know, not leftist or not socialist, the labourist inheritance of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, where they do lots of things that the Labour Party had always wanted to do, but could never do. National minimum wage, right to your trade union rep coming to your meetings with your boss, paternity leave for when you have children, just to give you 3 examples off the top of my head. They've done lots of labourist things, but there were different and new elements in New Labour, clues in the name. There were different elements in New Labour that were more conservative and that were new and that did come with Brown and Blair. And there are 2 emphases that I would wish myself to stress. The first is the idea of a social contract. The first is the idea that a society to succeed must be solidaristic. It must be glued together somehow beyond the pure law of the market. The Thatcherite market, which to some extent Blair and Brown both rejected and said that you can't just live in a market. You live in your family, you live in your church, you live in your local authority, you live in your youth club, you live in your scout movement, you live in whatever it is, right? And that's the emphasis they got from a set of ideas called communitarianism, often identified in its more conservative guise with Amitai Etzioni, who's a big influence on Blair. Because Blair's analysis is that crime has risen, unemployment has risen, urban deprivation has risen, because of the severing of those links to union, family, fatherhood, motherhood, extended family, or whatever it was, the ways in which we actually live, if you think about your own lives. So instead of thinking about this necessarily as a very conservative way of seeing the world, New Labour theorists, who are many in the 90s and are very influential in opposition as they often are, they emphasise the sort of horizontal links of society, not the top-down way in which government can help you. That's the first thing that they emphasise in New Labour. Second thing they emphasise is the dignity, the importance, the investment of work. So you have to work to earn your benefits with tax credits, mainly. So the single biggest group that New Labour intervenes with are low-income women who probably work part-time. Because you have to help people into work, because work is inherently good. And we can feel the kind of son of the manse kind of, my wife is a Scot, so don't worry. The Scottish influence of Gordon Brown's Presbyterian way of seeing the world, in that work is a good, and that work is right. And that, of course, you get trained at work, you get dignity at work, you get promoted at work. And so community and work are different stresses, except from within the Labour family. So the third element, which is relatively new, which is what does Labour emphasise? Well, in a rather similar way to Tony Crossland in the 1950s, they emphasise public services. Because public services is what's going to bind society together. What's the only institution, really, that all Brits love? National Health Service. Maybe the monarchy, maybe the BBC, but to a lesser extent. So if you can build up the NHS, not only is that a health policy, but that's a regional policy. That's an intellectual policy. That's a citizenship policy. So they emphasise public services as well as community and work. This is pretty much the only period where the NHS gets not just an episodic burst of money, as under the Conservatives, but a wall of money that goes up and doesn't stop staying up at increases of 6 to 8% a year in real terms. Like that productivity chart, we would kill to have this today, and it would dry up our post-COVID hangover quicker. Although the NHS is actually beginning to turn that around, even with kind of down here 2 to 4% increases. Steady state in the NHS is probably here. They're above a steady state the whole time, especially in the second term of New Labour in office, and that buys you extraordinary gains. So early on in the process of NHS reform and refinancing, 500,000 people waiting 13 weeks to see their consultant. Then 3 or 4 years, 0. Similar, waiting 26 or more weeks, 150,000 people with their very painful chronic illness, their hernia or whatever it is perhaps, more than 26 weeks, within 2 or 3 years, 0. I actually vividly remember going to a GP in this period and having something wrong with me. And they said, take this slip and go to the hospital now and they'll see you today. And I looked at this slip in incomprehension and said, what the hell are you talking about? And lo and behold, I could just give this slip in and get a test the same day at the hospital from the GP. So the NHS was working in a way it never had done before, and it possibly never will do again in my working lifetime. I was going to quote my working lifetime left, but I'm being recorded. So criticising New Labour is also about, and critiquing New Labour is also about grappling with these enormous improvements to public services. So we've got, satisfaction with the NHS goes from about 0, which, as I say, is pretty good, and it zooms up to plus 40 and more. People had always liked their local hospital because, of course, the NHS, although you have to wait, is usually pretty good if once you are seen, once you are treated, but the overall NHS goes up, right up to here. And of course, it's now sagged right back down, like so many indicators below the bar, below 0. And we could do that with a huge number of indicators. To wind up, don't worry, I'll wind up. This is at the heart of a series of big policy wins, which do go with the grain because they're pushing with what the public want and where the public are going, and also the development of society and the economy anyway. So when we see a fall in pensioner poverty, that's partly done through pension credit, higher pensions, more benefits linked to pensions. But of course, coming online are a lot of very, very generous defined benefit pensions, as well as people who worked in the post-war retire. There's something else to make my heart something less than sink when I look at my own pension and when you look at your pensions probably. But equally, about half of this effect is probably policy intervention. Not only that, but we see an enormous fall in child poverty. These were successes that Wilson and Callaghan had also aimed at and had failed to grasp in an atmosphere of inflation, economic crisis, constrained budgets. I mean, we could talk a little bit about New Labour's view of history and view of previous Labour governments in our discussion. That was the old Labour stream in the New Labour DNA, but there was another strand in the New Labour DNA, which is that although Labour cared a lot about poverty, and it cared an enormous amount about poverty and did more to reduce poverty than any other government for decades, it didn't really care about inequality. And in the words of the aforementioned Peter Mandelson, we are extremely relaxed about people getting filthy rich, but remember, so long as they pay their taxes. So there's a two-prong. There's a two-prong to that, to be fair to New Labour. And inequality, which of course had surged upwards in frankly, the disaster of the early 1980s, it stays about similar. And that is what the economist calls running up the down escalator. Because rich people and the ultra-rich and the top 1% or 3% are just zooming upwards. So although the bottom 10% are zooming upwards as well, you're not catching them. You're just keeping pace with them. And we could look at top 10, bottom 10, top 30, bottom 30, and they all look like that. They all look like stagnation in the Gini coefficient, not improvement. However, we need to think about the counterfactual, where instead of spending that boom on public services and tax credits, New Labour spend it on tax cuts, which would have meant this graph, which is basically a Robin Hood story of taking from the richest 10% in benefits and taxes and adding it to the bottom 10% under New Labour. That graph would have looked exactly as it does under the Coalition and the Conservatives, which is precisely the other way around. So, funnily enough, it matters who you vote for. So, if you're critiquing New Labour, which I do in the book, for a start, not going far and fast enough on child poverty, for instance, and also talking out of the side of its mouth about its real achievements, you have to also grapple with this. Because if I showed you just this chart, you would think, who are these crazy socialists taking over the United Kingdom? And of course, remember that although we critique Starmer and Reeves, their redistribution chart looks a bit like this as well. So to finish, I often think about this as a kind of postmodern or post-structuralist government for a kind of postmodern age. It's a bit like that Catherine Bigelow film Strange Days with Ralph Fiennes in it, where you kind of, or it's like 2001, or I'm reading a lot of Ballard at the moment, which is probably not good for you, but it's also a Ballardian moment when something is shifting, images are becoming more important, commercial activity is becoming more about what's in the ether, what's literally in the cloud now. And New Labour was very much something we have to treat historically as historians in that mould. It was something that was a chameleon. And indeed, Blair himself was a chameleon, and the left and the right hate him so much because they just cannot land a glove on him. Because when you throw the punch, he's changed between you throwing the punch and the punch landing. And he's changed his argument, or he's changed the frame of his argument. And as I get older, I think about left, right, it might just be good and bad at politics. But New Labour, they face left, they face right, they face forward, they face back. It's a very, very complex hydra-headed form. Because what does it do? It's a massive increase in welfare if you work, in tax credits that boost your income. But if you don't work, you get basically inspectors come round and you get a firm like Capita or a contracted firm come and try and bully you into work. It faces in two directions. This is by no means a good omen always if you're poor or if you're long-term sick, where someone tries to make you work in McDonald's when you find it hard to stand up for long periods of time. It pretty much abolishes sentences less than a year long for lots of reasons that will occur to you, which is they're a complete waste of money, custodial sentences that are very short. But if you've committed what in the United States would be seen as a felony, a very serious crime or a violent crime, you're going to go away for longer with, by the way, a National Council on Sentencing, which will set minimum tariffs and it will force judges to send you away for 20 years, 25 years. And indeed, there are the now notorious indefinite prison sentences under which a very few people are still suffering when you just can't get out of jail, even though your crime was 25 years ago. It suborns the third sector. It gives the third sector, for instance, in fighting homelessness, an enormous amount of money, but it kind of nationalises those charities and makes them fit a single mould, a single outlook, a very much New Labour consumerist outlook. So it's left, it's right, it's forward, it's back. It's very much like the Roman god of the doorway, Janus, who not only looks left and right into the street, but looks back into the household, back into the past, but also out into the world, out into the future. In some ways, rather like the new liberals of the Edwardian period, were the culmination of liberalism. So they pass Irish Home Rule, they pass wealth taxes, they abolish most of the powers of the House of Lords. So the liberalism is kind of culminating. This was kind of the culmination of Labourism. Once you've passed tax credits, compulsory recognition of trade unions, devolution, peace in Northern Ireland, etc. Right to roam over 10%, 12% of England's land. You've won all these victories that were fights for socialists since the Victorian era. Where the hell do you go then? So there is also a kind of exhaustion feeling about Labour, which we now partly suffer with, because what is this government for? What is Labour for? It's much less clear. The future might look like the past. It should possibly look more like the past, where we were more interlinked with our neighbours, our fellow religionists, etc. I haven't talked about Tony Blair as closet Catholic. I will do at any moment talk about Tony Blair as a redolent of Catholic social teaching, which we now can see with the Pope's conflict with Trump very, very clearly, that's a very important thread. But the future is also not just going to look more communitarian, it should look more like change, ongoing change, on-rushing change, cascading change. So New Labour, to summate, is a complex phenomena, set of complex phenomena, which basically is full of ideas of the past, full of ideas of the future, full of ideas of the left, which I've stressed, but also ideas of the right. So it looks to rehabilitate, it looks to punish, it looks to grow, but it looks to hold together. And in that, I think, is the secret of his success, which is it is such a broad coalition that it fills the waterfront of British politics, and even Blair has to invent his own Potemkin opposition in the Treasury because there isn't any other opposition. But with that, I'll finish, and hopefully we can have a good discussion. So thank you for listening.
Great, thanks very much indeed, Glenn. That's great.
So we've gone over a bit.
Bit of time for some conversation and questions. I'll kick us off. So
sure.
If you end with this postmodern kaleidoscopic government facing in different directions, pulled in different ideological ways, can you come to a judgment about the Blair governments that people, other historians and politicians have done, which is on the one hand to say actually this is no longer recognisably Labour or Social Democratic. This is, if you like, David Edgerton's judgment in his book, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation. It's just continuous with Thatcherism, with a bit more money. And a similar critique from the left. Basically, this is a neoliberal government that just spends the fruits of growth well. Versus another that says, no, this is a modernised social democratic government. It draws on liberal traditions as well, but it's definitely recognisably progressive, and all the things it does show that. So I suppose I'm not asking you to come out. I think I know where you would fall on if you asked to pose it in those binary terms, but is it possible to come to that kind of judgment? I mean, is there a way of thinking about this government, or is it something where we have to think actually it's much more messy, contingent, and has all these different elements at play?
Well, I think, how long have you got? But I think the first thing to say is we can come to a judgment, but it should be, as you said, with rejecting the binary, it can be very, very mixed. It can be a very mixed judgment. And we can be sophisticated, and we can talk in a kind of populist, accessible way that says, well, something can be lots of things. The Johnson and Truss and Sunak governments were a huge amount of things, and we don't worry too much about saying that. I would place myself, as you would have heard in the subtext there, more on the social democratic end of that kind of spectrum that we see it on, because when we see its actual effects, these are just vast gains for working people, for basically the person on the Clapham omnibus, as John Major would see it, right? Which they hadn't known since the mid-1970s and the inflation of the 70s, which had pushed differentials so close together and had caused inequality to fall. So that's the case, but if we change the register, if we go from, I'm a policy expert, if we go to intellectual or philosophical or kind of media projection spectrums, you go further to the right, because they're always talking about crime and cracking down on crime in the broadcast projection, or they're always talking about the communitarian elements and not the liberal elements, or they're always talking about the competition rather than the concert. There's a relative re-regulation of the economy is going on here, where the government is getting bigger and there are a lot more regulations than there would have been had Major continued in 97. But as one of the economists of New Labour who was in government said to me last week, every single time they went and said, we're going to do stuff to help workers, the first line had to say, we're still the freest labour market in Europe. bullet point 1 had to say that because Tony insisted, as it were, that it said that. So it depends. You know, incredibly boring academics' answer is it depends. It depends what we're looking at. If we're looking at redistribution and public services, there's absolutely no doubt that almost any council estate you want to go to on the fringes of any English city or town gets new library, new community centre, new school. I mean, every single primary school is rebuilt or remodelled. To the extent that makes you very gloomy now, because we just can't imagine that level of ambition. However, it is the case that rhetorically, and I criticise this in the book, they don't build a new language of social democracy that says we must redistribute and we must rebuild the public sphere. Quite apart from anything else, the economy won't succeed if you don't. And that Starmer and Reeves also very much struggle with to bring it up to date.
Great, let's go to some questions then. Who'd like to kick us off? Yeah, gentleman in front of you.
Yeah. I remember very well some of the IT disasters, but can I speak up for the ambition?
Yeah.
Because recently, I mean, this is anecdote. I've had a number of very good experiences with as a citizen, interactions with government that can only, I think, have come about because of, and this is a phrase that was used at the time, joined up government.
Yeah.
Like, you know, when I was dealing with my late mother's affairs.
Yeah, tell us once. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I had exactly, and I got a brown envelope from DWP, and I thought, oh God, what have I not done? Opened it. Oh, here's a bit of winter fuel allowance. We didn't, you know, we owe you and we didn't pay you. Winter fuel allowance, something that used to exist. Something I think underlying in the way the government uses IT, I think, has gone very right. In the last 20 odd years.
Or as all truly boring people say, I'm glad you said that, because I actually speak to the person who was head of UK Digital as one of the interviewees in the book. And actually, one of our enormous successes in the UK is online government. It's just incredible, which actually making tax digital is a bit of a step back from. You know, the tax return, the NHS portal that I had cause to look at this morning, they're fantastic when compared to most states, honestly. In France, it's just impenetrable, you know, wiring that Macron's been desperately struggling to kind of join up. And that is Blair came back from the G7 twice and said, people are talking about e-government, we must have the best e-government. Which it caused this back office integration that you're talking about, which no one can see, which creates what is now one government. We're now moving from government gateway to one government, which, of course, Blair would put all of it in the ID card, but you don't need to do that to get the advantage of the services. So what we're talking about with Tell Us Once is when, you know, your elderly parents die, you just put it in once, and all of the social security, all of the rent, all of the, you know, information goes everywhere. Very few states have that.
It's fast, accurate, really helpful.
So I was being a little bit facetious about e-government because some of those were successful. Like they did put an internet webbed terminal in every school, which in 1998-99 was new and ahead of most.
It was called the National Grid for Learning.
That's right. God, you.
Yeah, gentlemen here.
Thank you. So I just turned 30 on May 1997. So seeing a period of my life being taught as history now is quite something. My name is Tim Hunter. I'm now here as Professor in Practice for Sport, but 30 years ago I was the head of media relations for the Confederation of British Industry.
Oh.
And that period of New Labour attraction of and courting of the business and industry sector was a profound sort of influence on the period. And the CBI particularly actually was an organisation that both Blair and Brown targeted. And I sort of wanted to turn this into a reflection, into a question, because part of me looks back on that period, and it's almost a definition of the great man of history type idea. That it was such a charismatic leader that the business sector was willing to be taken down what was on occasion, as you just said, quite a Labour agenda. I can remember just as in the first year, the minimum wage, the social chapter, the working time directive, all these things that came out of Europe. So I guess to the extent in your book, to what extent is Blair a shaper of the era, or the era was right for Blair? Because we also have Clinton and Third Way and all that.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's worth actually also picking up that transatlantic point, because although, as you said, you know, Blair was very pro-European, he probably would have joined the euro if it just been left to him. But also he had, you know, lots of transatlantic links, not just over Iraq, but intellectually, one of his techno things is because he believes that America is the home of this kind of internet revolution.
Yeah.
It's coming to the UK. He's completely enamoured of American Democrats. And so just in terms of the kind of intellectual, adding to your kaleidoscope, you know.
America.
Yeah, but how much of it is this kind of, it's post-1990, the Berlin Wall has come down, American capitalism is hegemonic, it's producing this ICT revolution. Does that produce Blair? Does it produce Blair and Brown?
Well, there's lots here, so we'll come to America. I'm currently writing a chapter of a book about the future, which is the vision of America as the inevitable future. And Blair is very enamoured of that, and he still is today. We're saying AI, big data are going to be the future, going to transform the economy, transform government. So he's always been attracted by that because the United States is the youthful country. It's the cutting edge of the future. It's where you wear. You know, this is the first time you see your prime minister with a guitar dressed in jeans. This is an Americana. You know, definitely, and he drives a Ford Galaxy, an American kind of bigger SUV car, right? These are important cultural tropes. So that is the case. And again, in the book, remember that Brown and Blair visited the Clinton victory and the Clinton campaign twice in 92-3. And they said, you know, the New Democrats, it's just a crib, New Labour, to some extent, which is, we must be more centrist, we must have an appealing candidate, and by God, they've got an appealing candidate in Clinton. But remember, there's a couple of new books out about this. Clinton had an enormously ambitious health agenda, an enormously ambitious economic agenda, where rebuilding infrastructure, like Obama and Biden, it's not different, will form a kind of gathering point of a new FDR-style liberalism. Yeah, it gets defeated because he gets hammered in the midterms. Again, nothing ever changes. But you can learn a lot that's got very, very complex intellectual lineages from America, but it's very American. Something about picking one thread from that, this also talks to the way in which actually it was easier, because you could just phone the CBI, right? You could just phone the newspapers. You just phone head of BBC One or head of news, and you didn't have to deal with this flood of incessant social media and new media and kind of extremely partisan and extremist media. Because if you wanted to take someone with you, you just had lunch with Rothermere and you just tried to convince them, and you just used your kind of beam of charisma to do that. So it's much harder. But on the other hand, I think for historians, this question you say about great man or great woman of history is really, really hard. Because, you know, you can say age of Gladstone, age of Lloyd George, age of Thatcher, but the tension between Lloyd George was incredibly important in the war effort in 1917 in reinvigorating the Cabinet Office and creating a core. But equally, that idea was in the ether. So the ragged boundary between what's in the ether and someone who can sell it is very important. But we have plenty of prime ministers who completely fail to synthesize what's in the ether. Like, you know, potentially you could argue Keir Starmer, or you could certainly argue Rishi Sunak. You can argue David Cameron, who flunks the ability to have a kind of liberal, conservative, Baldwinite settlement, just completely lets it all fall to pieces, right? So political skill is important, because John Smith would have won that election in the counterfactual, probably less, probably been a much more slow-moving Labourist government, would have had lots of successes, but would it have had that huge majority and won 3 times? Probably not. So political leadership does matter. As we see today, you know, people are crying out for Andy Burnham because he's better at politics.
Great. Yeah, over here.
I've got about 87 questions. Speaking of the old gifts in the room as well, I was 25 when...
I was 22. It wasn't different. That's different. Exactly.
Yeah, I was 25, but I'd already spent 3 years working with vulnerable kids. So I was working in a city council youth centre with Salford, and also working in the voluntary sector with marginalised and vulnerable kids. And actually, everything that happened within New Labour in what you were discussing in terms of third sector and the kind of nationalisation of the third sector, that idea of just got absorbed into an arm of government policy. Yeah. And delivery, that was my career, basically, for the next 20 years from that point on. But I just wanted to come back to what you were saying at the beginning of the questions, because I'm curious about if you can't find a language of social democracy, and if there was no way for New Labour to express that, define it, and then hand it on to Labour in the future, has that played a role in our kind of more diffuse ideological state over the last 15 years? That that sort of feeling that people hold ideologically very, very different kinds of opinions about a variety of topics without ever feeling sort of ideologically whole. There doesn't feel like a kind of, a firm sort of set of language for social democratic ideas.
Well, that's a really profound question, and it demands a profound look at politics everywhere, because this can't be rooted just in the Blair and Brown settlement, because that's happening everywhere, whereas German social democrats are on 15 to 20%, and leading a government looks a long way away. And you can go, the French socialists have been obliterated for exactly the reasons you talk about, which is the threads just all come apart into a green movement, into a left movement, and then into social democrats who continue much more skinnily, far fewer of them. So the way we consume information, which I've already mentioned, is one reason for that, but there are lots of others, like extreme consumerisation and segmentation of markets and ways of living. So, you're a gamer or you're a skater. I've got a young kid, so this is what I think. Whatever you're into more of a niche. So holding together a synoptic politics is much more difficult. I'm sure both of those people, both Brown and Blair, would say that. One of the reasons they don't hold, but there's lots of reasons why they don't hand on, which they could have been more successful, although these general trends are ongoing. They could have been more successful, but Blair and Brown, of course, are in some ways at war. So they kill their darlings in one occasion, their actual darling, which is that they knock off people who are coming up, because you're either Brownite or Blairite, and one side kills you politically. So you're John Reed or you're David Miliband, or you're and you get assassinated politically. So there's not the continuity, where Wilson was quite happy for Callaghan to follow him. Quite pleased. That was more conservative than him, but that's okay. This was not like that. I think also this is not just down to New Labour. This is also down to Miliband Labour and Corbyn Labour, which is especially Miliband Labour. It is a catastrophic mistake to reject New Labour rather than to say there was lots wrong about New Labour. We can build on it, or we can do it differently. To actually do the kind of Predators speech just makes it completely different. And so, Ed's move away from New Labour, I think, is a later mistake. And what I would say about lots of these areas, like public services, like immigration, a lot of the mistakes we associate with New Labour are actually after New Labour. It's Boris Johnson with 1.2 million people coming into the country. It's not Blair and Brown. We haven't even mentioned Sure Start, which is one of the things in your story, which is we can even see the Blair and Brown generation going through the data, healthier, better teeth, taller.
And you can see it going in the opposite direction now.
Yeah, and all of these numbers, so I could do rough sleeping and homelessness, they just reset back to where they were in 1996. Unless you have, like these people have, this, I nearly used the word like crazy, which I don't want to use, but intense hyperactivity. Which again is the wrong word, but you know what I mean, which is these people, like Alistair Campbell, they just wake up at 6 and they're like, how can I destroy the Tories today and how can I make things better? And that's very, very difficult to get. You don't get, Blair said to me, I was really, really lucky with my team. Because you're not just looking at Blair and Brown, you're looking at, Mo Molam, Harriet Harman, you're looking at Michael Meachie, you're looking at just this team of Robin Cook, Donald Dewey, you're looking at a team of rivals. I got into trouble with a member of the present cabinet by saying, well, it's not as good, is it? And they said, well, that's a bit, we always think that because we look back and we see better. But I think I'm sticking with one of my...
I mean, there's a, did you have a,
You were talking about how Labour hadn't talked about their achievements enough. And I was wondering if you could imagine a kind of election campaign that would be successful, that was based on public service spending and celebrating all of those achievements.
Oh, that's good. Well, I think I can, because the 2005 and the 2010 campaigns, and remember the 2010 campaign is quite successful. Labour wins, 252 seats when they could have gone down the drain and come third, right? So, and both those campaigns were based on a lot done, a lot more to do, which is the right tone, which is look at these enormous successes. For instance, we're going to go further on health service reform so that you'll see a consultant in any specialism within 2 weeks, not just cancer, which is crazy compared to where we are now. okay, where the NHS is getting better, but it will be a very, very slow rescue process. So I can imagine them because we've already had them. But you have to be able to sell that in terms that people can understand in their own lives. You saw that line of their people's own lives, public services. They always like their school and hospital more, but you have to get that general line up closer. And at the moment, the lines of those two are just unbelievably far apart. So we have this, what are we in Gallup now? Minus 42, like sentiment, economic sentiment, one of the worst in the world. And that gloom is actually, although partly justified, it's just not justified at that level. To close those jaws up, I don't necessarily know how to do that, but we have seen campaigns that do that.
Great. Well, Glen, thank you very much. I think we're probably sort of out of time now. One thing I think that is worth reflecting on that, just that last bit of the conversation, is the things that endured from that period were successes and have stayed in place. Minimum wage, pensions reform. We're about to vote in elections this week in Scotland, Wales, devolution, Greater London Mayor. Other areas, as you've said, Glen, the graphs just go straight down after they leave office. So what is it about your statecraft and what is it about governing that enables some things to succeed and endure and not get reversed and others to be susceptible to reform, which is an important lesson, I think, for certainly people on the sort of social democratic left.
Well, some of the Brownite elements, because Brown is such a policy technocrat, they are not unravelable, and he sets the traps. You remember Osborne tries to unravel universal credit, which is really the tax credits that we see up there, and completely fails, because straight away everyone who's working on low income says, how can you cut my wage? That's a deliberate Brown. That's actually a deliberate Brownism, that it's a big bear trap, that no government can unpick that. Similarly, devolution was something that Blair really inherited and wasn't fantastically... He went along with it and he liked it, but he wasn't fantastically enthusiastic about it. You remember he talked about the Scottish Parliament as having the tax-raising powers of a parish council. The old 1998 Scottish Parliament has many more powers now. And of course, I'm from a background in Northern Ireland where that has also abided. But that's because, like that pension reform, it went with the grain. That Northern Ireland settlement wouldn't have happened at that moment, that year, in that way without Blair and Bertie Ahern and David Trimble and everybody who was there. But actually, the demand from the grassroots of Northern Ireland was just, we've had enough. And so this was petering out because it was just grotesque, which I know very well. So sometimes what gives you longevity is either your technocratic detail that, like Brown, you sweat at 2 a.m. putting these numbers in, or like Blair, you can feel, almost like Harold Wilson you could feel what people think, almost like in your nature. Like AGP Taylor talked about his green fingers, he could just feel where the documents were going to be. Well, some people like Wilson and Blair just can feel public opinion, like naturally, somehow. And so there are 2 ways of entrenching longevity. There are probably others.
Great stuff. Well, Glen's book, there's a flyer over there, there's a QR code on there, so please do pick one of those up if you want to buy the book. Otherwise, do stay in touch with IPR. We have lots of events like this, and you can subscribe to our newsletter. So just have a look at the website, you'll see all our details. But can I ask you to thank Glen in the usual way for coming today?
Thank you.